Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish, part one of our review of 2023. My name is Brian Liddy and it's Sunday the 24th of December, and today I'm joined by Linda Fabiani, former MSP, now retired. Good afternoon, Linda. How are you doing?
Hello, absolutely fine, thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
So this is going to be the first of this review. Part one is going to cover January and February of 2023, and usually on all of our daily shows we start with a Ukraine update. So I thought you might want to know that on back in the 8th of January. Earlier this year, it was already 319 days old, the war in Ukraine with Russia. And coming up at the end of February, 24th of February, that would have been the anniversary of the start of the war. So just really, what do you think about what's happening in Ukraine and the fact it's still ongoing?
Oh, yeah. Well, I do remember Russia were going on about how quick it would be, but here we are, as you say, all this time down the line. And I mean, that's what, almost 2 years now that Broadcasting Scotland have been doing their daily update. How's it going? Oh my, just so many casualties, so much damage, and recently there hasn't been so much of the talk about Ukraine making advances, so it's all very worrying. And of course, Putin has started to get very confident with his speeches to others, and doing that huge big question and answer session that he did the other day. So he seems to be a lot more confident. I think it's really concerning the way that President Zelensky, is having to do the rounds in the international community, begging for help, because the enthusiasm to help seems to be waning. Of course, we've got Palestine happening there as well. So, way back January and February last year, there was more hope that Ukraine would be able to repel this invasion. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm internationally for helping Ukraine at that time, and a feeling that Russian people. I remember thinking very much back then, Brian, that people in Russia would not put up with this and would be really discontent. And of course, there were some demonstrations. That seems to have all tailed off.
Yeah, and
So I don't think there's the same hope now that there was in January and February this year
yeah, and back in
that
Jan.
democracy would prevail.
Yeah, and back in January as well, I was looking back at the news items that we covered, or that we actually broadcast. Russia was known to be struggling, and yet they're still sort of, it's not over yet. They're still going on, aren't they?
Yeah, it's just awful. And of course, we're not hearing nearly as much about it now in the mainstream media uh, as we were in January and February this year. So
Yeah, I've got a list of some of the things that did happen. So in January, Russia was using Iranian drones to attack the Ukraine, and Ukraine actually downed about 500 of them at that point. And the Ukraine struck a Russian-controlled building that was housing Russian troops. That was razed to the ground in Donetsk region. So again, it just seems like the same kind of things that we're hearing now. Not much has changed.
no, it seems to be going on and on and on.
And yeah, there was also discussions about President Zelensky would be talking about how he met with President von der Leyen, and they were going to promise financial aid and military support. NATO countries at that time, back in January and February, were discussing their defence spending targets and were calling for a minimum of 2%. Again, these all just sound like things that I could have read out last week on Scotland at 7.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, but there was also in January and February 23, there was a general feeling that the entire international community was willing to help, as I say, to prevail and make sure that democracy, was what was important in the world. That seems to have changed rather. So, like I said, the hope of January and February seems to have diminished somewhat.
Yes. So, shall we move on to the next item, which is roughly we've rolled together Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the European Union. So back in January, I'm trying to think, I think Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak was still Chancellor. Members of the House of Lords were preparing to slow down attempts to axe thousands of pieces of European Union legislation that had been carried over from Britain's time in the EU. UK government ministers promised to review about 4,000 pieces of EU law that had been derived from the UK's membership at the time, and experts were warning that the UK faced disaster if the government did push ahead with those plans, given how little scrutiny they'd been given. Then, cutting a long story short, tell me if I've got this wrong, Boris Johnson resigned in shame. Rishi Sunak won the leadership race and became leader of the Tory party. And then Sunak attempted to reform the Northern Ireland Protocol, and he planned to ditch Boris Johnson's controversial legislation, which was to unilaterally rip up Brexit arrangements to do with borders and trade. Yeah, that's what I was saying. So Sunak is now Prime Minister and is ripping up Boris Johnson's controversial legislation. There was a lot at risk, wasn't there, with the Northern Ireland Protocol about going back to violence, and if it was to fail. Brexit put it at risk.
Right there, Brian, and I was having a wee smile to myself there, because you've obviously just blocked Liz Truss completely from your memory.
Yes, I do actually have her here.
Probably a very good thing to do.
You're absolutely,
and the country has tried to do that as well.
You're absolutely right.
But of course, the Tory party has tried to do that. Because
I've got it written down here. By February 2023, Truss was gone. 45 days to wreck the economy. So thank you for. She is so easy to forget, isn't she?
Oh, as I say, the Tory party's tried to forget that too, pretend it never happened, and we have ended up with Mr. Sunak. I hadn't, until you said that, realised how long he'd been in office, because he still seems to me very much like the new boy, because he hasn't, I don't believe, made his mark, and seems to be running about from pillar to post trying to do so. So yeah, the Northern Ireland Protocol. Again, back then, Rishi Sunak was going to sort it all. And then there was it the Windsor Agreement or something?
Windsor Accord, yeah.
Windsor Accord, was that it? Where it was all going to come right, and he'd managed to bring the DUP on board and stuff.
He basically bribed them, didn't he?
Nothing much seems to have happened since then, Brian, and the rest of the year. Certainly, one of the big things about Northern Ireland is the fact that the Assembly's not sitting. It wasn't sitting in January 23, and it's not sitting now. So there's a real disadvantage there for the people in Northern Ireland not having proper representation. They still haven't sorted out the Northern Ireland Protocol. There seems to be some issues about the Windsor Accord. So here we are at the end of the year. I would suggest no further forward in this issue than they were at the beginning of the year.
Yes, and I'm just looking at the running order, and the reason that I probably didn't mention Liz Truss is because we're going to be talking about Tory corruption, which is a major theme in 2023, I would say, and I had her down in that part of the running order, but so we can talk about her again. And you've just reminded me, Rishi Sunak, he gave that incredible speech where he went to Northern Ireland, didn't he, after he'd got the Windsor Accord or the Windsor Agreement set up, and he told all these workers in a factory about how they had a fantastic deal because they were still in the UK and they were still in the EU, had a foot in the EU, and they could trade with both, and how fantastic that was. And we were all sitting listening to that going, but didn't we used to have that?
Yes, and you took it away, Mr.
Yes,
Sunak, you and your cronies at one fell swoop. Yes,
and he
and
set it out
Scotland
in a.
best to be back in there
Mm.
as a full member of the European Union with these advantages.
And again, Brexit, it's worth saying, I know this is meant to be a review, but Brexit still isn't done. It wasn't done in 2022, 2023. There's going to be more border changes coming in next January, and the Northern Ireland Protocol is going to be put at risk all over again.
Yes.
So it's ongoing. It's how many times has it been postponed? These changes that are going to be coming in January. So it'll be interesting to see if they happen. Is there anything that I've missed to do with Brexit, Northern Ireland Protocol, or Europe? Anything that you'd like to
Well, no, the only
say?
thing that strikes me, Brian, is that I seem to remember, being part of the review we did on Broadcasting Scotland last year. And as far as the Northern Ireland Protocol is concerned, as far as representation in Northern Ireland is concerned for people, it's almost like a repeat of last year's programme. There has been no move further on, despite all the fine talk and the fine speeches from, I think, the fourth Prime Minister that's been involved in this. So that's all I would say. Roll forward to next year's review and we'll see what January 24 brings. As you say, there's more changes. I suspect at the end of 2024, we'll be saying more or less the same things in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yes, and I think it would be good to maybe have a list of how many prime ministers we've gone through, how many home secretaries, how many chancellors, how many, and see how many we can have forgotten already. It has been incredible in that sense. So, shall we move on to the next item, which is the economy, the British economy, UK economy, and the cost of living crisis. So in January, February last year, Russia had reduced gas exports to Europe after its invasion of Ukraine. Forgive me. European nations rushed to fill up gas storage facilities around this time last year amid fears of shortages over the winter. There was a likelihood of power cuts in the UK, but we were told that the chances of power cuts were diminishing because it was a very mild January, February. It was a very mild spell, if you remember. So there was reduced demand for heating in the UK and in the rest of Europe. Businesses and schools and charities were waiting for an update from the UK government on plans to extend a non-domestic fuel initiative beyond March. And the UK's food insecurity became apparent when we all witnessed empty supermarket shelves. And yet, I suppose that's really a bit of a first world problem, isn't it? But Linda, do you remember discussing any of those things when you were on the programme last year?
Aye. Yeah, well, throughout the year, of course, but January and February last year, it was all a bit worrying about the fuel issues, wasn't it? And we were talking about, how expensive fuel was becoming and what help the UK government should give or were likely to give. Yeah, I mean, fuel prices are still high. There were some mitigations put in place. But they're still high. There's still the concern. Of course, this year there's no talk of potential power cuts, and the real issue of empty supermarket shelves that we were talking about last year, and that we did in fact have. But there are still ongoing problems with it. Of course, there are. Fuel prices are still really high. Folks are finding it really, really difficult. It all ties in with the cost of living generally. We're still talking about same things we were talking about in January and February, which is about inflation, interest rates. Doesn't seem that we've moved hugely forward. All the talk that we now get about, inflation is slowing down. It doesn't mean you get back what already has been the cost of inflation. So it's not the good news story that they try and spin it at. The economy is still in a mess. The UK still has a huge debt burden, which we've covered well on Broadcasting Scotland lately. So again, it's almost like a standstill in so many things. We move a wee bit, but we've not had any real solutions since January and February.
Do you remember
They're still managing, is
do you remember?
probably the best way to say it.
Yeah, and do you remember there were all those mass rushes for by folk to get their meter readings in before the prices would get
Oh God,
hiked, and
yes,
you know,
yes,
so
yeah.
and of course prices are about to go up again next year, in
Yeah,
early
and I'll
next
tell you
year.
something else that hasn't changed, Brian, are the profits of the power companies. The profits of the power companies are still pretty good.
Yes, I think on last night's show I quoted British Gas made 939 billion pounds profit last June,
Yeah.
or it might have been 959 even. It was definitely two nines. And the UK economy, I mean, it's recently been described as going. We're supposed to be doing a review of January, February, but it was recently described as going backwards,
Uh-huh.
wasn't it? And you can see that in January, February already.
Hmm.
With our
Well, like the beginning of 23, January, February, we were all hugely concerned about the UK economy. And looking for, well, Liz Truss and her cronies, that of course had just made it worse. And there was all this talk of how Rishi Sunak, this wonderful guy who had been Chancellor, was now coming in as Prime Minister, was going to solve everything. Well, I'm still waiting. So we're nearly a year down the line. Nothing much has really changed there, apart from the debt burden having grown.
yes, and because Liz Truss was Premier, even if only for 45 days, we now get to see her at the Cenotaph every year, and she gets hundred
Yeah.
thousand pounds pension. I think, doesn't she?
Aye. Aye.
So yeah, that was all back in 2023 when she was
Yes, I don't
Prime
reckon she'll
Minister.
be suffering too hugely from the cost of living.
So, do, yeah, I keep wanting to talk about what things are going to. I have to stop myself. Shall we move on to the next item, or 'cause we're going quite fast here? Do you want to slow down a bit, or
It's been a quick year, Brian.
that's true. So, yeah, these are all perennials, I would say. So, Alistair Jack and the Section 35 order, when he challenged a bill, two bills that were put through by the Scottish Government. One was to do with gender recognition, and the other was, oh, I'm struggling. Can you remember, Linda? The two Section 35s? The GRRO and the but I'm
Oh,
thinking of
yeah,
the deposit
the,
return
the, the
scheme.
DRR one, Brian. But that's not to say they weren't interfering in all sorts of other ways, which they were, of course. Yeah, no
Yeah.
matter what the Scottish Government does.
So it was the voice in my ear is telling me it was to do with the Internal Market Act.
All right, yeah,
And
that wasn't a Section 35. It was just the general
yes,
interference and telling us we didn't have the power. Yeah,
yes.
as you.
Maybe, maybe we should just talk about Mr. Jack in general. So back in January, February, what would he have been doing? Um, Again, you can tell that I haven't had much time to put any notes
Well,
together
do you
on
know?
this.
Yeah, I am quite stunned to learn that that was away back in January. It doesn't seem that long ago. There was the when they did issue the Section 35, when Scottish Parliament almost unanimously passed a bill on gender recognition reform, and Mr. Jack, Secretary of State for Scotland, or whatever his official title is now, I think they changed it, decided that it should just be stopped by Westminster. And he did. And he just said, no, you can't do that. And it was just another in a long line of interference in what I would like to think of as the sovereignty of the Scottish Parliament and represent the Scottish people. But of course, the reality is that the UK Parliament is sovereign, and Scotland is actually not allowed to make its own decisions. So that's what that was all about, and it carries on. And they've more or less said that, Scotland will only be allowed to do what they wish Scotland to do. So it really is a kick in the teeth for devolution. The great hopes that we had for devolution, we had even Donald Dewar at the start saying it was a process and not an event. Here we have a UK government that says, well, we don't actually care about that. You'll do what you're told. We're back to the parish council that Tony Blair was talking about. And talking about that, I'm not convinced that a Labour government under Keir Starmer will make it any different.
Yes, and I've just remembered something that I did read earlier on when I was reading through past programme scripts that we had done this time last year. And I do remember there was one item on Alistair Jack where he said that there was no appetite for independence in Scotland. So that famous phrase dates from last January, last February. And
Does it really?
Yeah, and so somehow it seems to be a Tory trait that they just seem to know what Scotland wants and what Scotland thinks and what Scotland needs, without maybe really asking Scotland. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, but I think it even goes further than that, Brian. I think it's just another of these things that this Tory government do. They lie. And they go by that tenet that says if you tell a lie often enough, people will start to believe it. And I think it's a deliberate strategy by them. They decide what they want. They then put it across as reality. And if they repeat it often enough, they believe that with their saying it often enough, with their supportive press saying it often enough in headlines, people will start to believe it's true and take that as reality. Therefore, it becomes reality. I think it's a deliberate strategy.
I think you might be right, Linda. I'll move on to the next item, which is Kevin McCarthy and American politics. So this time last year, in January, there was a new US Congress opened with House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy grasping for his political survival. McCarthy was a strong Trump supporter, although he did hold Trump partially responsible for the attempted coup on the Capitol on the 6th of January in 2021. So Trump is something that runs right through this item and ran right through 2022-23 and continues, as we all know. But back then, McCarthy was seeking far-right backing to win his US House of Representatives Speaker vote. Potentially, he was going to become the very first nominee for Speaker in 100 years to fail to win an initial support from his own colleagues in a high-stakes vote for the gavel. And in the end, McCarthy did fail to secure the majority of votes cast on the first ballot, with all Democrats and 19 Republicans opposing him. This was the first time since 1923 when a Speaker election for the first ballot did not produce a Speaker, and that all kind of unfolded by the end of February last year. So I think it took something like 15 ballots before the final result was settled upon. Can you remember anything from that period, Linda?
Do you know,
With
I
American
remember being
politics?
totally confused by what was happening, Brian. And, the American politics works very differently from ours, of course. And every so often things happen there. And I think, oh, I need to read up on this again because I don't quite know how this works. And I remember doing that because I was stunned at as you say, 15 ballots to get a guy elected as Speaker. Um, and of course, he's not there anymore. After all that effort, he ended up going anyway. I can't remember how long he was in for. I think, Brian, it was a matter of months.
I think you're right, and I'm actually
For.
struggling to remember. When you get to my age, my memory, I never did have a good memory, and it's getting worse now. But I'm kind of I didn't quite get to the bottom when I was looking into this as to why his colleagues on the right weren't on his side. He actually.
Yeah, it was that thing about that mad caucus that there is, that the Trump supporters that just strike me as being absolutely right wing crazy people.
It was
The way they behave.
the
So I
freedom.
think they eventually did for him.
Yeah, it was the Freedom Caucus, and he had to
Ah,
make
that's what they call
concessions to
themselves.
them.
Yeah.
So he had to concede quite a lot of power and
Uh-huh.
things to the right wing of the party before they would support him. But I can't quite remember why they didn't support him in the first place, why they wouldn't want their man to straight away go straight into
I
the
think it was
post.
because he'd done a wee bit of a turn on his support for Trump. Whereas previously he'd been with them and said, is totally supportive of Trump, who was a marvellous man and should be president again and completely innocent of any wrongdoing. And then he started to talk about, well, maybe, when we had that trouble at the Capitol in Washington, maybe Trump did have something to do with it. And he started wavering in that. And of course, all these Trump supporters in the Republican Party turned against him for that and wanted their own person there. I think it was that basic.
Yeah, I think you're probably
But
right.
do you know? But see, even following American politics this year, or trying, when I say following, being rather confused at times by American politics this year, and in despair a lot of the time, it just seems to have gone crazy. When you look at the court cases, for example, the Supreme Court cases that the Republicans have been pushing. When you look at some of the state laws that have been enacted about different things, and then you look, there's a former president, as we speak, in court for many things, still being supported as potential president again by people who have been elected to look after the country. It's most bizarre what's going on in the US.
It's incredible, and I'm thinking back to January, February earlier this year. Both sides of the Atlantic, over here we were watching the Tory party spin out of control due to the results of the fallout from Brexit, I would say, eventually, pretty much. And then another car crash happening at the same time in America. So it was like which way are we looking now?
Well, it's always said that what happens across the Atlantic ends up coming to us. Yeah, and we see that so very, very often. We seem to follow on in so many things, whether it be culturally, politically, financially. We seem to look to the US rather than look to our European partners,
So do
which
you
I would
think
far rather do.
So do you think Boris Johnson did take some leaves out of Donald Trump's book then, when it comes to?
Um, well, I think they certainly behaved the same way in many ways. Arrogance, for example, not doing the detail, not being good in detail, just coming out with big pronouncements all the time. So I don't know if Boris was actually following Donald Trump, or whether they're sort of two of a kind in a way, personality wise. This belief that they're always right strikes me as something that's very similar in them.
You think
If
it
I
just
say so, therefore it must be,
you
which
think
is
it
a
just
very,
comes you think it just comes naturally to him then?
it would seem to, yes, and a non-caring about effect, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, it would seem to come that. I mean, I have to say, I think Donald Trump's way beyond Boris Johnson in any of that, because I think Boris Johnson is actually quite smart and maybe perhaps thinks things out a wee bit more. Whereas I think Donald Trump just starts from the point that is the great I am, and if he thinks it must be so. I don't think he is necessarily that smart, really. Of course, I'm saying all this through knowing neither of them, Brian, and it's total speculation. It's just impressions that I get of watching behaviours.
But a strong impression, I'd say. So let's move on to Tory corruption. Nadeem Zahari and Boris Johnson again, PPE, and the NHS up for sale. So as we've already established, I think in January, February 2023, by February, Truss was gone, having had just 45 days to wreck the economy. She was followed by Rishi Sunak, who became Prime Minister. He gave his first speech of 2023 in January, and Rishi Sunak set out his 5 promises in that speech, which he claimed would reflect the people's priorities. And those were that he would halve inflation this year, he would grow the economy, he would make sure national debt fell, and he would make NHS waiting lists fall. And lastly, he would pass new laws to stop small boats so that people who come to the UK illegally are detained. Responding to that speech, the SNP's Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP said Rishi Sunak's speech was an advert for why Scotland needs independence. So, Linda, your thoughts on that episode?
Well, I think Stephen Flynn was absolutely right there, but it's just the behaviour of Westminster government over and over again, to me, shows the need for independence. And certainly last year, when with Nadim Zahawi been shown to have been, what would you say, economical with the truth? Well, in fact, worse than that, it lied by omission, and he hadn't said he was being investigated, I understand.
That was
By
over taxes, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was HMRC was investigating him for non-payment of taxes. And and when you've got somebody who's in a trusted position being elected, in an even more trusted one being member of the government, but at the top of what should be trust and financial issues, the Chancellor of the blooming Exchequer, and it turns out he's hiding this. And it's just another step in what I term to be corruption in the UK government. And they just keep getting away with this stuff. Okay, that man lost his job as Chancellor and he's not in the government anymore. But we still have a government that allows these things to happen. And it's just one thing on top of the other. Whether it's Lords, members of the House of Lords, making huge profits out of people's misery by PPE, and then saying that it was nothing to do with them. I'm talking about Michelle Mone, of course,
We'll
who
come
by
on to
her
her.
own admission decided not to tell the truth. Whether it be members of the government who just seem to get away with so very, very much lying, hiding things,
And
making sure the cronies are all right.
there's very few
Oh,
resignations, aren't there?
sorry, Brian.
And there's
I
very
was
few
on a rant. I missed you there.
and there's very few resignations. I think there's only one that I can recall, Pincher. No, everybody else seems to be able to stay on despite
They
these.
just get away with it. That whole government shouldn't be there anymore. When you look at just the way they keep behaving. And they do it with impunity. And that's even before you get on to the stuff about ignoring the law and, just carrying on their own sweet way. And what really worries me is that this seems to be becoming the norm. And it's comparatively recent that it's been as blatant. It's been with this particular Tory government that it has become so blatant that they just keep getting away with it and think they can do whatever they like. And it worries me that this has set UK politics back a long way. It worries me even more that Scotland is part of that. Because I don't want Scotland to go down that road. I really, I want Scotland to be a beacon of honesty and transparency in its politics. I think we can be, but it takes being independent. And we shouldn't be tied to what I am now seeing as an increasingly corrupt United Kingdom political settlement.
Yes, and that word that comes up so often, I'm sure it would have been used in January, February last year, which is like mitigation when it comes to Holyrood. That's all they seem to that they're able to do. You mentioned Michelle Mone, so I've got a little bit here. This was, I don't know if people would realise it was in the news back in January. The Guardian reported that the UK government had accused PPE MedPro of supplying defective gowns that would have compromised the safety of patients had they been used in the NHS, and compromised the safety of staff also, obviously. PPE MedPro is linked to the Scottish Conservative peer Michelle Mone, and she was paid £122 million for 25 million sterile surgical gowns under a contract awarded in 2020 by the Department of Health and Social Care after she had approached UK Minister, specifically Michael Gove, and offered to supply the PPE. The Department of Social Care, Health and Social Care rejected the gowns because they were not sterile. And of course, I'm not allowed to talk about the present, but that is still ongoing and very topical at the moment.
Well, funny you say that, because, we always think that can't talk about the present, but here we had this company, PPE MedPro, that Michelle Mone said was nothing to do with her. And we can't talk about the present, but she's just made a documentary talking about it, in which she admits having been linked to PPE MedPro and says she should have been upfront about that at the time. Yes, she certainly should have been. So that's ongoing, and I understand that all this faulty equipment is still being held somewhere.
Yeah, I think.
Of course, it's never
Yeah, I
been
think you're right.
used.
We're spending millions storing the equipment, and then I think they
Yeah.
also spent millions maybe incinerating a lot of it.
All
Bit of
right, I don't
both.
know about that,
A
but
bit of both.
that bit's ongoing as well, about payback. They should not be able to just pocket that cash and make off.
Yes, especially when we're about to be asked to pay £16 on top of our energy bills to pay for money that energy companies, although perhaps the 122 million, and could be used to instead of us having to pay another £16. But let's move on to another general theme of which is the media in early 2022-23. I was glancing at news items that we were covering back then about the UK Culture Secretary, Michelle Donnellan, who recommended that the government drop its plans to privatise Channel 4. A letter had been leaked that suggested that ministers would instead push the broadcaster to move jobs out of London. Donnellan set out her plan for the climb down in a document sent to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, just to be clear, and this of course was after Nadine Dorries' disastrous handling of the sale of Channel 4 News. Linda, I don't know if you remember that Nadine Dorries, she didn't even know how Channel 4 was funded. She thought that taxpayers were supporting it, and she was found out by Mr Nicholson, your colleague.
Yes, the blessed Nadine Dorries. Oh my goodness, yeah. I'd managed to put her out of my mind, Brian.
I'm
You've
sorry.
brought her back. There you go. Yeah, that was all a debacle as well.
And
Do you know, it seems longer ago than the beginning of 2023, but there you go. So much has happened. Yeah, there was there was talk, as you say, about Channel 4 divesting some of its London jobs. I seem to think Glasgow.
that's happened now. They've got a base in.
Got some of the Channel 4 jobs that
Yeah,
came from that, or the Channel 4 work,
it was between
which
Leeds and
suits.
Glasgow, and Leeds got the biggest prize, and Glasgow's got an office, based in just on the edge of
Yeah,
the
so I
merchant
was I
city.
was quite I was quite pleased about that. That was good. Although it's still not a Scottish broadcaster. They might be using Glasgow, but they're not broadcasting news through a Scottish prism, which is what would, from a Scottish point of view, it's still very much a UK institution. Yeah. But yes, I do. So that was way at the beginning of last year. Um, but we also had all the BBC scandals and stuff as well, if I remember rightly, in January,
Yes,
February.
Richard
John
Sharp.
Nicholson MP was very good at weeding out some of this stuff too.
Yes, and were you thinking of Richard Sharp when you mentioned the BBC?
Yeah, generally. there was a bit of a scandal about the chair of the BBC, and there was also all the talk about, at the beginning of the year, the BBC getting a bit antsy because some of their presenters were seen as being political on social media, thinking
Yes,
about Gary Lineker in
yes,
particular.
and
So that was all at the beginning of the year as well.
I'm intrigued also by Emily Maitlis, the fact that she was very critical of the
Yeah.
BBC in her McTaggart lecture. After she'd left the BBC, she was able to say what she wanted, and when she left the BBC, I thought she would have gone to another big news organisation, but instead she set up a podcast. So is that a trend that started back in January, February 2023?
Oh gosh, I don't know how long ago that was, but there's loads of them doing podcasts now. So much so I started listening to a couple of them and then I gave up. There's just too many. But there's loads of former politicos, former journalists.
Alistair Campbell
Uh,
and Rory Stewart.
yes, all doing these podcasts. I don't know who they're talking to be honest. There's a bit of me suspects they're all talking to each other. We get it in Scotland as well. Yeah, politics is a bit of a village. And, of course, the press, the media, politicians, some academics are all part of that. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the listenership is of all these things.
Yeah. Shall we move on to? Oh yeah, sorry, we haven't talked about Richard Sharp.
Well,
So,
he was the chair, wasn't he?
yeah, Boris Johnson's fingerprints are over that
Oh, yes. He had arranged a loan. That's right. It was Boris Johnson's.
long lost
He's
cousin.
and Richard Sharp had arranged or helped to arrange that Boris Johnson would get a loan to help the Louise Sowell move house. That was it. And of course, it had never been stated again, that complete lack of transparency. And it all came out. And I think John Nicholson, MP, was quite instrumental in pulling all this stuff out. And of course, the man was shamed, as he should be, and had to resign. Yes.
So, well,
But again, that belief among that elite within our establishment that we have to be part of as part of the UK, there's that elite group there that just think they can get away with absolutely anything, help each other out all the time, and none of us common people should have any say in any of it. And the indignation they have when they get caught out, and end up having to resign or whatever, to save face for everybody else that is involved, and be the fall guy. Um, it stuns me what they think they can get away with, what they think is acceptable. And this was just another case of it for me.
wasn't that the same money that was spent on the wallpaper, the famous wallpaper that was hundreds of pounds a roll?
I seem to remember something about wallpaper. Yeah,
Yeah.
they certainly didn't go to B&Q, Brian, that's for
No,
sure.
and I think it's interesting that, I mean, technically we're talking about the media in general here in 2023, early 2023, and yet we end up talking about Tory sleaze and corruption again. It
Well,
just
yeah.
keeps coming up.
Well, it's all part of that same establishment, isn't it?
Yes. So we move on then to the next item, which is the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon. So this time last year, Nicola Sturgeon was still First Minister. She was still featuring in Broadcasting Scotland news items, for example, on the NHS, amongst other things. And then there was a surprise resignation on the 15th of January 2023. And of course, at that time, Humza Yousaf was still our Health Secretary. But of course, Ms Sturgeon's resignation kicked off the leadership campaign. So, Linda, you know both Humza and Nicola Sturgeon. What was going through your mind at the time?
Well, I know them both as former colleagues, of course, and even before being colleagues, I knew them through being a member of the SNP. They're both a good bit younger than me, of course. So yeah, I was absolutely stunned when Nicola Sturgeon resigned. I mean, it's one of these things about where were you when, and I remember exactly where I was. I was in the car and had to park up and listen because I was just so stunned, unexpected. So yeah, it was upsetting, sad for me. And then, of course, we had the leadership contest, and this all happened at the start of last year with the leadership contest, and Hamza Yousaf came through.
Should we just
And
say it was
became,
Ash Regan and Kate Forbes were the other
yeah,
two?
there was three contenders. At the time, I had hoped there would be more, that other people would come forward, but they didn't. So we had three people, which is very healthy, actually. The SNP was had a lot of people who could have gone forward to be the leader, there for First Minister. So that's a healthy position to be in. But we ended up with three, and I remember going to hustings and things. I thought two of the candidates were very strong, um, and I found it quite difficult to work out, who I thought I should be looking at. In the end up, I did support Hamza Yousaf because I went to hustings and I felt that he was putting forward the best case and the best responses for me. So Hamza Yousaf became leader of the SNP. He was then elected by the Parliament to be the First Minister of Scotland. I think he's done rather well. What I would say is that it seems to me to be longer than just the time since he's been elected, so that would be a mark of how well he has settled in. He certainly had a hard time. It's not been an easy baptism. So yeah, we're at where we're at. I think Hamza Yousaf's doing rather well. We've got an effective First Minister in Scotland, and we move forward.
Yeah, so Nicola Sturgeon's resignation speech, I mean, it came out of the
Yeah,
blue towards the tail end of February. I think it was 15th of February,
right.
if I'm right. Yeah, she resigned on the 15th of, oh, sorry, 15th of January. I'm so sorry. I've got it here in front of me. Is it February? Okay, sorry, the voice in my ear tells me I've got that wrong. That she did resign in February, 15th of February 2023. What did you think about the content of her resignation speech and the reasons that she gave, if you can recall?
Oh, I remember, I can't remember much of what she said, to be honest, but I do remember my own emotions at the time. And I remember sitting in the car listening to it, and I was really quite worried. Uh, I felt that there was a huge sadness in Nicola that was coming through what she was saying, so, and that she was being quite emotional. So I was quite worried about her, on a personal level. I didn't know why she'd resigned. I listened to what she said and I tried to understand why it had come so quickly based on what she'd said. Since then, I haven't listened to it again. I've chosen not to. Um, I don't know. I don't know why Nicola felt she
She
had to
gave
resign when she did.
she
I
gave
don't
two
know.
she gave two reasons to my memory.
Yeah.
One was that she felt that she had become a block to the cause. That's not the word that she used. She'd
Yes,
become
I know
a,
what you're talking about. Yeah.
and also that she
She
just
felt
wasn't.
people were talking about her
Yes,
uh, to the detriment of the cause.
and she was
And
concerned that she was maybe didn't have the energy to be able to go for the long
yeah,
haul. But
yes.
sorry,
Yeah, I mean, she just sounded knackered, you know, exhausted. Um, as I say, she sounded sad to me. But when you think of the the leadership that Nicola Sturgeon showed through the whole COVID pandemic and how difficult that was, and she was absolutely marvellous, the way she dealt with that, the leadership that she gave the country. In the face of not being able to always make the decisions that she thought would be best, because there was so many things tied in with Westminster. So the strain of that must have been absolutely huge. And everyone who's worked in any kind of high pressure job or who has had to deal with very difficult situations knows that adrenaline can take you through that, and you get there, and sometimes it's a bit after that that suddenly everything collapses and you're exhausted and you can't do any more. Becoming ill after times like that is something that's very common. So, you know, maybe I nearly said the lassie there. Maybe the lassie was just exhausted and it all hit her. Because she'd done a sterling job as First Minister for Scotland.
I was going
And
to,
I
you mentioned,
think that's recognised.
yeah, you mentioned COVID, and I think you're right there. But I was just going to ask you what about what you think her legacy might be in other terms, though, to do with Holyrood and the role of First Minister.
Um, well, I think there's, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest here. I think there was times she was over ambitious in what she said, was to happen. And the reality couldn't always catch up with the ambition. I think that's an issue. But then when you think about that, it's not bad to be ambitious. It's not bad to have aspirations for your country. It's not bad to want the best for people. But I think when all that dies down, there's legacies she'll have left that are longer term. The work that Nicola Sturgeon did for the recognition of children in care, young people from care backgrounds, I think that was huge. And that will, as the years go on, show very much. I think too what Nicola Sturgeon did for the status of young women is something that we have to guard very carefully. I'm a bit worried that we lose some of that, because this young woman that was Nicola Sturgeon, who became First Minister of the country, was a great example to younger women coming through. The way that she made sure she had a gender balanced cabinet, the way as leader of the SNP, she promoted um, young women and others who were underrepresented to end up becoming representative of the SNP and therefore in the Parliament. That's absolutely huge, and we should never lose that. It'd be far too easy to fall back into the old ways. So I think that's a huge legacy of Nicola Sturgeon that again will show in the future. And opening up politics to make it real for an awful lot of people is really important too. So, and of course, there's other things about legislation she took through. As I say, I think sometimes she was a bit overambitious in what could be achieved under the devolution settlement, because so many of the things that Nicola espoused came from the absolute belief that Scotland as an independent nation could achieve all these things. And that's what we want to do.
And you mentioned people that she had promoted, young women and others. So Humza Yousaf, he's a good example of that. And at this time last year, I was reading reports that Broadcasting Scotland had made where Humza Yousaf, as health secretary, was getting stick for the NHS, even though it was the best performing NHS in the UK. I don't know if there's anything that you want to. We should maybe finish on what you said about Nicola Sturgeon. I would say I would add maybe that also she put Scotland onto an international stage. Just by
Oh, absolutely. The respect that Nicola Sturgeon had internationally. And the other thing that I didn't mention there was her work for renewable energy, and the recognition that we have to move to zero carbon. She really pushed that. So, yeah, her legacy's pretty sound.
yes, and at COP27, she set up, not single-handed, but the SNP set up the Loss and Damage Fund, started that.
Of course.
And that's
Yes.
now, we're not meant to talk about the present, but it's COP28, it's just, it's growing. Other countries are starting to join in, so that's another feather in our cap.
Yeah.
Linda, I think maybe we should just draw to a close on that note. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, so we've January and February, my goodness.
Yes, and so there's going to be more. This is just part one. There's going to be other parts of, to cover the whole of 2023 in the coming days. But there's another thing that was a definite constant throughout 2022 and 2023, and that was Broadcasting Scotland calling for volunteers and for subscriptions. So we're not going to finish with the usual scripted call for subscriptions and or for people to come and help us here in the studio. But if you could do that, or if you want to do that, please do. But Linda, thank you for your contribution today, for your time this week, this weekend, and just to wish everybody at home, I hope you all have a lovely Christmas, and you all get what you want tomorrow in your presents. So, Linda, thank you, and to everybody at home, goodbye.